Good evening, everybody. My name is Ros Lewis. I'm a New Zealand registered psychotherapist. I've worked for 37 years in the mental health field, working with clients who struggle with depression, anxiety, trauma, addiction, which all involve many different kinds of grief and loss, as well as working with those who have lost a loved one who has died. I've been involved in higher education, training psychotherapists, counsellors and social workers. I am also a survivor of trauma, escaping a violent marriage and fear of my life with my 2 young children 50 years ago, in the days when there was very little awareness of intimate partner violence and what could go on behind 4 walls with pretty flowers in the front garden. I'm currently doing a PhD in creative writing, where my project is a memoir of my lived experience of domestic violence and the long-term consequences of such trauma. Tragically, intimate partner violence is still a major crisis in both Australia and New Zealand. Women are still being murdered or injured by intimate partners or ex-partners, thus the urgent need to keep on breaking silence about this continuing global epidemic. As well, 2 years ago, my beloved oldest granddaughter Dahlia died without warning of an unexpected medical event at only 22 years old, which has rocked my world and that of my family. So I feel well qualified both professionally and personally to speak about navigating grief and loss with you this evening. The following illustrations from my clinical practice involve 2 different scenarios about grief and loss. One, when a loved one has died. The other concerning the loss of a career and self-esteem due to prolonged workplace bullying, sadly so prevalent here in Australia. The clients I will mention tonight have each given me permission to tell aspects of their stories of grief and loss. I will not use their real names. Mary, aged 71, came to see me nearly 4 years ago after the sudden death of her only daughter from a brain aneurysm. Her daughter was 41 years old. Mary was struggling with deep sorrow, manifesting itself in depression and anxiety. Her husband was managing his grief by not talking about it and busying himself with activities, a not uncommon response to grief. Mary felt desperately lonely in her sorrow. She lit a candle every night at home to honour her daughter Sophie. She would bring a glistening white round hat box into each session, filled with precious memories and photos of her Sophie, including letters Mary regularly wrote to her, telling her about the grandchildren, Sophie's children. Having a safe place to cry and talk, which Rob has referred to, having a safe place to cry and talk about Sophie has been essential for Mary, which included the excruciating details of having to turn off Sophie's life support machine, as well as bearing the knowledge that Sophie's heart was beating in someone else's body. Sophie had registered as an organ donor. Each time she was out, Mary would wonder if that passerby or this one had her daughter's beating heart inside of her, and she struggled intensely with feelings of jealousy that that person was alive and not Sophie. She felt angry and resentful, being guilty about her feelings. At the same time, she was glad that someone else had been given life through her daughter. She could not reconcile this turmoil of conflicting emotions. It was a long time before she could confide in me her complicated feelings and private sufferings about this. Slowly over time, Mary has picked up her life in some of her previous activities. She's had to accept that her husband may never be able to talk about his grief in the way that she needs him to. People navigate grief so differently in their lives. I have learnt this also within my own family after Dahlia's death. Mary still comes to see me about once a month now, compared to weekly at the beginning of her grief journey. She continues to need a safe place to talk about Sophie, as well as discuss what's happening in her current life. She still brings in the glistening white hat box every time, so we always have Sophie in the midst of us, acknowledging her presence in the life she lived. I notice that Mary's face is still lined with sorrow. I believe deep grief does change us and carve its own unique wounds into us. And also, Mary is enjoying life as best she can. I ascertain that it is possible to continue to carry the sadness of grief and loss within. How can we not? And at the same time still choose to live our lives to the best of our ability. This is the hope of authentic healing in my experience. It is not that the sadness will ever disappear. When we love deeply, we will always miss that person. Nonetheless, I believe that eventually, sadness and joy can hold hands at the same table. That is what Mary is finding out, and what I'm finding out also 2 years after my granddaughter Dahlia's death. Grief is still there, but gentler now, not grabbing me by the throat and throwing me to the floor like it used to. David has been a participant in a trauma psychotherapy day group I facilitated at the psychiatric hospital I work at. It is a 12-week program that I developed, focusing on understanding trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder and its impact in our lives. Participants can range from having experienced the injuries of sexual abuse, rape, domestic violence, workplace bullying, car accidents, being in the police force, fighting in a war, or frontline first responders to traumatic events in the community. I teach about 3 stages of recovery after experiencing trauma: establishing safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection, as described by Judith Lewis Herman in her excellent book, Trauma and Recovery, which I highly recommend. The remembrance and mourning stage focuses on the grief and loss experienced after trauma, the way we need to mourn and grieve what has been before trauma, what we have lost as the result of the trauma, how life has changed and we now have to adapt to a new reality, a new normal, and that there is no quick fix. We must learn to live more gently with our wounds, not fight against them. David is a loving husband, father, grandfather, and a devoted family man. David worked in an industry he loved for many years. Recently, he experienced ongoing workplace bullying by a toxic CEO in his company. David says, "Like many blokes, I thought it was weak to talk about my feelings. I bottled things up, did not let on to my family how much I was struggling. I didn't know anything about looking after my mental health." David attempted to end his life by jumping off a roof. He survived, but now has physical injuries to contend with and to recover from, as well as mental health recovery. David has learned the hard way the cost of not talking about his feelings of grief over the loss of a career that he loved, and the psychological impact of being bullied in his workplace. He has loved being part of the trauma group in the company of other trauma survivors, learning that he is not the only one who struggles with the tentacles of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The benefit of a group process is that clients learn from each other as well as what I can offer them. His anxiety has lessened, along with his feelings of shame over his suicide attempt, and he is becoming more confident and empowered in his life. When I asked him if he was okay for me to tell part of his story for this talk, he said, "Of course, I want to be able to help others if I can." Judith Herman speaks about finding a survivor mission. It means that I cannot change the past, but I can make it count for something. She states, "While there is no way to compensate for an atrocity, there is a way to transcend it by making it a gift to others. The trauma is redeemed only when it becomes the source of a survivor mission." My book that I'm writing about intimate partner violence is my survivor mission, hoping that my experience can help and educate others. On one occasion in one of the trauma groups I facilitated, I was telling participants how they can manage when they feel their nervous system being activated by a trigger. I said jokingly, we have fun in the groups as well. Say to yourself, damn, there goes my tricky nervous system. Fuck PTSD. At the end of the group program, when I asked them what was the main thing they had learned, they all quoted back to me, damn, there goes my tricky nervous system, fuck PTSD. Not really a brilliant intellectual clinical intervention on my part, but effective nevertheless. They even thought that that should be the title of my book. Mary is fortunate enough to be able to afford therapy sessions. David has the opportunity to access a hospital day program through a work cover claim. Many who suffer with grief and loss, either from the death of a loved one or from the multi-layered impact of a traumatic event or events, do not have access to individual therapy or group programs. In a society that often urges us to just be positive, which in her book Emotional Agility, psychologist Susan Jeffers refers to as the tyranny of relentless positivity, the authentic expression of difficult emotional states is frequently inhibited and discouraged. In so doing, we create a dangerous environment where people like David throw themselves off roofs. They feel so desperate to end their emotional pain, so lonely in their depression and states of anxiety, consumed with grief and sorrow, and unable to articulate it. Sandra Bloom, a psychiatrist who has studied the effects of trauma, highlights that people who are traumatised learn to inhibit their emotional experience because they recognise that other people are unwilling to deal with people who are emotionally upset and will pull away. Consequently, victims of trauma begin to inhibit their own emotional expression and avoid discussion of the trauma. This goes exactly in the opposite direction of what they need to do in order to recover, which is to be able to talk about it. I have lost count of the number of times clients have said to me, either in individual therapy in my private practice or within the group therapy setting, this is the only safe place I can say how I really feel. Out there I can't. Let each of us be a safe person for our friends, family, work colleagues and acquaintances to talk to us about how they are feeling and not feel frightened of being judged. We do not have to fix them. We just have to listen and to care. That in itself goes a very long way in alleviating their suffering in the lonely wilderness that is the territory of intense grief and loss. To finish, I'll read to you a poem that Michelle, another client, a participant in the recent trauma group, wrote for all of us at the end of our last trauma group. This is what she wrote. We came together from all disciplines and all walks of life, united in our experiences of bullying and strife. PTSD was our collective label. We sat in a windowless room with no table, which is true at the hospital I work at. We were exhausted by the constant urge to fight or flight. We were traumatized with no respite. We disclosed all our suffering, anxiety and pain, how bullying bastards made it their aim to try to break us, to pull us apart, their acts full of cruelty and absence of heart. Our dignity was clearly trampled into the dirt, but we could only heal when we acknowledged our hurt. We didn't engage in trauma Olympics measured by the scores of our afflictions, comparing ourselves by symptoms or diagnosis, if whether my trauma was worse than yours was. We learned to have patience and avoid self-scorn. We completed tasks with enthusiasm and were willing to learn. We had emotional conversations which helped us develop and grow. We learned more about each other than our loved ones will ever know. We gained our power through meaningful connection. We shared our experiences despite fear of rejection. We learned about trauma and mental illness, created mindful moments through breathing and stillness. Some concepts were unique and led us to feeling perturbed. but we held ourselves kindly when we went back into the world. Now we've had 12 weeks of learning, laughter and tears. Trust becomes something precious we've learned from our peers. So as we leave here today, we will try to remember to be gentle on ourselves, to totally surrender, to accept that our best effort is more than enough, and there's better ways to say no without saying fuck off. Thank you for listening.